evening. This is the 8th of the 10 Perfections class. And tonight we'll be talking about Upekkha, equanimity. And equanimity, oh, good. We have people on the other side now. In the Bodhisattva vows, or Bodhisattva vows in the Theravadan tradition, the aspiration for Upekkha is, may I ever be calm, serene, unruffled, and peaceful. May I gain a balanced mind. May I have perfect equanimity. May I serve to be perfect. May I be perfect to serve. Always wondered where that phrase came from. Anyway, Upekkha is found in a lot of the lists that we have in Buddhism. It's found in the 5 powers, for instance. It's found in the 7 factors to enlightenment. It's found in the 4 sublime attitudes or sublime states. It's actually found in the Eightfold Path under the as a subheading underneath samadhi. I'm sorry, I still have a little remnant of the cold I started out with last week. You can probably hear that in my voice. The 4 sublime states are love or loving kindness, metta, compassion, karuna, sympathetic joy, mudita, and equanimity, upekkha. In the Pali language, these 4 are known under the name of the Brahma-vihara, and you'll hear that a lot if you study the original canon. Now, we've already talked about metta and compassion. Metta being the idea that I hope all beings may be happy. That's my aspiration, that all beings be happy, that all beings be not suffer, not be stressed, be content with what they have. And compassion, karuna, has to do with actually getting up and doing something about it. Otherwise, if you're not acting on it, then it just turns into maudlin sympathy. And sympathy is not bad, it's just inactive. It's an attitude. All these 4 here are considered to be the highest ideal of how one can deal with day-to-day life. There we are. They are great removers of tension, the great peacemakers in social conflict, and the great healers of wounds suffered in the struggle of existence. They level social barriers, build harmonious communities, awaken slumbering magnanimity, long forgotten, revive joy, hope long abandoned, and promote human brotherhood against the forces of egotism. What these 4 attitudes are actually meant to do is break down barriers. If we can have maha metta, maha karuna, maha pithi, maha equanimity, and equanimity should be great anyway, the great loving kindness, the great compassion, the great sympathetic joy should be universal and applied universal. From everything from the people we love to the people we don't know, even the people we dislike, and even the people we dislike intensely. This would be just a nice way to go through life. Social barriers would have to be dropped if we were like that. You couldn't have classes or castes. We couldn't make that kind of a distinction that somebody is better or worse because of their social position. As a matter of fact, if this were actually practiced, and Buddhism was a universal practice, almost said religion, excuse me. If it were a universal practice, then there would be no national boundaries. Everything would be open because people should be free to come and go, to be where they enjoy life. People should be able to eat what they enjoy. People should be able to have a right to health care and so forth. And so this attitude of loving kindness, compassion, joy, sort of keeps us open to everyone that we encounter, which is probably a good idea. But they also support one another. Metta, for instance, guards compassion, because unbounded love guards compassion against turning into partiality. It is so easy for us to decide who or what we're going to be sympathetic to. I was driving to an event where I presented this morning, and I had realized that most people were put on this earth to annoy me, especially the ones driving cars, especially the ones driving cars in front of me. It is very hard to be magnanimous, sympathetic, have thoughts of loving kindness when some bozo drives out in front of you and cuts you off. It's really hard. Karma snaps in a minute, and all the hostilities that I've ever felt suddenly arise. But if I keep the attitude of the four sublimities, then it's not so difficult. My blood pressure doesn't go up. My testosterone doesn't get rattled. My adrenaline doesn't start to flow. And getting to my destination, which was my only purpose in life at the time, went a lot smoother because I didn't let these feelings get away from me. We also feel discrimination in who we feel sympathy toward. Because the national media is focused on an event in one part of the world, we often find that we forget about being compassionate to somebody in a different part of the world. It is easier to feel compassion for a squirrel or a bunny rabbit than it is for a mosquito or a spider. We are very discriminatory on how we show our compassion to others. We select some, exclude others. But Metta keeps us from doing that, because that starts off with the idea that every living thing deserves to be happy. After all, we're all doing the same thing. Buddhism is so simple on that. Nothing is good or bad. No one is good or bad. We're all doing the same thing. We're just doing it differently. And what we're doing is avoiding pain and trying to be happy. So knowing that everybody is in the same boat, everybody from the spider to Mahatma Gandhi and the Dalai Lama, everybody is trying to avoid pain and be happy. I know Mahatma Gandhi's no longer with us. That was a slip of the tongue. I was trying to think of living people. Love imparts to equanimity its selflessness, its boundless nature, and even its fervor. That excitement that we feel to help others, to wish others goodwill and kindness. Tempers our sense of apathy, that all things are the same. In World War II, Japanese Zen people were very supportive of the war. They were very, very patriotic. And one of the reasons was because of the teachings on emptiness. If everything is empty, nothing matters. And they thought of this as equanimity. Well, if you're going to have equanimity, one should also practice loving kindness and compassion. People of the Pure Land faith often went to prison because they did not support the war. Pure Land Buddhism places a higher priority on compassion than Zen did at the time. Today things are different. Everything changes. Today, all of Japanese Buddhisms stress love and compassion over cold-hearted intellectual activity. Love also imparts the equanimity. A power to hone in on what needs to be done at any given time. So we don't make judgments on whether this person deserves it or not. We just go ahead and do it. Now, Karuna guards Metta. If love guards compassion and equanimity, compassion also guards loving kindness and sympathetic joy. It prevents love and sympathetic joy from forgetting that while we do good things for other people, the joy we are giving them or participating in is temporary, and it's very limited in what we can do. Because even while we're doing nice things for other people, there's still horrible amounts of suffering states in the world. Just listen to the news. Go to CNN for 2 hours. If that doesn't bring you to tears, I don't know what will. Happiness coexists with an infinite variety of misery. The happiness that people experience seems to be rather limited. And we'll talk more about why that is in a few minutes. There's more suffering in the world than we're able to mitigate with our actions. Seems like every time we help one person from suffering less, we can find 2 or 3 more that are suffering just as greatly as the first person was. And even if we do help them, that help, that joy that they receive is temporary, and it will change. The bad news is happiness is impermanent. The good news is misery is also impermanent. So it works in this kind of a secular thing. That's why we have the wheel of life, the Dharma wheel, in every monastery and temple in the world. It's to remind us how everything is constantly changing. Our attitudes, our thoughts, our condition. It's always changing. But there is a long range effect. We have to think of the long view. If we work on ourselves and help others, eventually we'll be able to get to the point where sorrow and pain doesn't repeat itself. And that is called nibbana, or nirvana for you Sanskrit talkers. And again, it's something else we'll talk about again later. Compassion also guards equanimity. It protects it from falling into cold indifference and keeps it from becoming lazy or it keeps us from becoming selfishly isolated and immune from the sufferings of other people. Equanimity, when seems to have gone through some changes in definition over the past 2,600 years. When the original Canon was being formulated, equanimity just simply meant evenness of mind. It did not mean all things being equal, that there is no good, there is no bad. If we look at the original teachings as presented in the Pali Canon, the oldest version of the teachings, we find that there is a great deal of goodness and badness in life and the world. We just can't say nothing has qualities. When a child becomes ill with something serious, that is not a good, happy thing. There are moments of happiness for the child, for those around him, but those moments are very short-lived. We can't really say that being unhealthy is a good thing. It's not the end of the world as we know it when someone gets sick, but it certainly changes their world considerably. Equanimity doesn't mean we need to be indifferent about that the person who is sick is equal to the person who is well. It doesn't mean that at all, as a matter of fact. What it does mean is the ill person needs help just as much as as a healthy person. They're having a different kind of a problem. Problems are universal. They just seem to manifest in different ways. Compassion, until it is perfected, urges the mind of equanimity to continue battling in the world against suffering and harmfulness. Equanimity, the mind that has experienced equanimity, has to be battle-hardened in this kind of a confrontation with suffering in the world. Otherwise, it sinks into a feeling of futility, which is very easy to do. Now, Pithi, joy, holds compassion back from being overwhelmed by the sight of the world's sufferings, from being absorbed by it into the exclusion of everything else. The joy that we feel keeps us from becoming morbidly sympathetic about everything. There's joy everywhere around us, or causes for joy everywhere around us if our mind is conditioned to it. As I sat in the parking lot, I watched two rabbits and a squirrel playing with each other like they were family and friends. There's a certain amount of joy in that. It may sound a little weird, but I find a certain amount of joy when I see a dandelion in a finely kept lawn. Looking at the dandelion, wow, you made it. At a monastery I was once at, our neighbors were very angry with us because we liked dandelions and we didn't pluck them out of the ground. Actually, we harvested them for food. Really annoyed our neighbors, especially at seed time. There's joy in seeing native plants. Some people would call them weeds and pull them out, trying to create an artificial beauty. But there is beauty in that which is natural. And there's certainly beauty in what most people would call imperfection. Asymmetry, we call it. Sympathetic joy also relieves tension. It soothes the painful burning of the compassionate heart. When there's nothing we can seem to do, we can look for these causes of joy, actively seek them out. What can we be happy about? We can be happy in the fact that our own suffering is very changeable. And if we look to others as causes of joy, we'll look at ourselves a little less. This sympathetic joy also keeps compassion away from brooding. Remember back in college, way back when, and that's, I was in college at about the same time the Dead Sea was still alive, long time ago. And I remember one of the courses was on the Romantic period and how brooding Lord Byron was. And brooding had become fashionable in college in those days. It was about the same time, it was during the Vietnam era. But brooding can become very fashionable. We have people that are called, what are they called, EMOs, or goths. They brood. They find comfort in their brooding because it supports their view of the world. If we can develop active sympathy in the form of compassionate action, then we too become supportive of our worldview. If we really think everybody deserves to be happy, then being compassionate and feeling joy for them when good things happen becomes an affirmation of our worldview that everybody deserves to be happy. Very simple, very reasonable, hopefully logical. And sympathetic joy gives to Upekkha as well, equanimity. It gives equanimity that kind of serenity that softens its hard appearance. It's the divine smile on the face of the Buddha. It's it's a smile that persists even though we know that there's a lot of problem in the world. It gives us hope. The sympathetic joy also gives us fearlessness and confidence. And how does it do that? Excuse me. That's why the sleeves are so long. We use it as a handkerchief. How does it do that? When you're happy, you don't feel fear. When you know there's hope, we don't plummet into despair. If we have confidence, then we usually don't accept no as an answer. Equanimity has to be rooted in insight, though. That famous word, vipassana, or vidassana, whichever version you like. It has to be rooted in that. It has to be a restraining power for the other three viharas, the other three states. And it becomes that by keeping things on an even keel. Because if equanimity is rooted in insight, then it is totally aware that nothing remains the same. Everything changes, and these changes are part of the cause of suffering, dukkha. Dukkha is the second insight. And the third insight is conditionality. Everything is affected by everything else. The suffering we see has causes. We can be part of the resolution by not being a cause of suffering ourselves. If we're not causing ourselves suffering, we're happier. If we're not causing others suffering, then they too can become happier. It sounds logical, and it's true. And equanimity guards metta and karuna. Equanimity guards love and compassion from being dissipated because our emotions got uncontrolled. And we just went with them without thinking it through, without seeing impermanence, without seeing conditionality. All we're seeing is the suffering. We're seeing things have changed from being good to being bad, and we run with it. Equanimity is a vigilant self-control because it seeks out the final goal. It doesn't allow sympathetic joy to become euphoric hysteria. It does not allow us to lose sight of the goal, the aim of this practice. And the aim of this practice is awakening. The aim of the practice is nibbana. That's the final destination. Equanimity, even-mindedness, gives love and even unchanging firmness, a loyalty, and it causes us to become patient. Remember, patience is not only a virtue, it's one of the 10 perfections. Kanti. It is called an unshakable balance of mind. When equanimity, and here it says equanimity is a perfect, unshakable balance of mind, that's when it's been perfected. It works out that way. It's rooted in insight, but it has are you okay? An unshakable nature. It's not dull, it's not rigid, it's certainly not heartless. Its perfection is not due to emotional emptiness. It's not due to that at all. It's due to an emotional fullness. A fullness aroused by understanding. It's complete in itself. Its unshakable nature is not the immovability of the dead cold stone, but the manifestation of highest strength. An arahant, the foe destroyer, the one who completes the path, is an arahant because of the equanimity, because he is so comfortable, he or she, your girl, arahants as well, are so comfortable in their own skin, they forget the self that we find very important. It's like if you're wearing shoes that are too tight, you notice them all the time. Well, if our mind is too tight, we become very self-conscious. If we're comfortable in our own skin, if we're comfortable with who and what we are, we can forget about who and what we are. I wear sandals a lot. I don't think about how tight my shoes are because they're not tight. I really don't think about myself that much because I'm pretty comfortable wearing my body. Whirls of emotion and the meanderings of intellect vanish with Upekkha. Unhindered calm. The majestic stream of consciousness, that luminous mind we talked about last week. Watchful mindfulness, sati, penetrative keenness of wisdom, panya. It has balanced strength of will, viriya, and calmness of mind, samadhi. And these 5 inner faculties are called indriya, have grown into the inner forces or powers called bala. And they can never be lost once they're attained. They cannot be lost because they do not lose themselves anymore in the labyrinth of the world, samsara, which literally means the wandering. How we wander through our many states of mind, thanks to the endless diffusion of papancha. I finally remembered yesterday why I think the word papancha is so funny. Not because it sounds like an Italian food. It's because I associated it with my childhood. Because every Saturday morning I would get up and go to watch the Cisco Kid and his sidekick, Papancha. I think his real name was Pancho. But in my mind, I conflated the two and it turned into Cisco Kid and Papancha. Anyway, he was the guy with the horse that wasn't white. So, Papancha means the seeping or leakage. And it's like when we get one thought, it naturally leads to another. And then on and on and on and on and on until we created this entire construction of a fabricated life. We've construed things to be what they're not and forgotten what they are. Equanimity keeps us on that even keel of seeing things for what they are, not for how we imagine them. And if we look at some of these words here, we will notice we have seen them before. Now, sati means mindfulness. We just saw that one. But wisdom was one of the 10 perfections, as was viriya. Samadhi is meditation. That is strength of will, determination. That's one of the 10 perfections. So, these words keep coming up because they're pretty important. Now, there are 2 kinds of equanimity, and the Buddha says what they are. There is, O monks, worldly joy. There is unworldly joy, and there is still greater unworldly joy. There is worldly happiness. There is unworldly happiness. And there is still greater unworldly happiness. There is worldly equanimity. There is unworldly equanimity. And there is still greater equanimity. Okay, 3 kinds. There's a typographical error up there. Then there is worldly freedom, there is unworldly freedom, and there is still greater unworldly freedom. Now, that's 3 levels of practice that we're dealing with here. Equanimity is connected like this to the rest of them. If we had a table, which we do, we could see how we work our way up. We start out with worldly joy, work our way to happiness, work our way to equanimity, work our way to freedom. And this happens in the worldly level, the unworldly level, and the still greater unworldly level. And they always work in the same way. You go from joy to happiness, to equanimity, then to freedom. So what is worldly joy? Worldly joy has 5 things that cause it to be. They are joys found from sight, from hearing, from smelling, from tasting, and from our tactile sensations. Things that are wished for, desired, agreeable, and endearing, associated with the sense desire, and tempting to lust. It is the joy that arises dependent upon these 5 chords of sense desire, which is called worldly joy. Well, there are 6 senses, the intellect being the 6th sense in Buddhism. So, what happened to that? Well, the 6th sense is the thing doing the desiring. So it's sort of built in there, whether we like it or not. Whoops. And it graphically, it comes like this. If we have something that we see that we enjoy, that comes out to worldly joy. If we hear a sound that we're really getting off on, music or birds or whatever, that contributes to our worldly joy. Taste sensations like bacon or a BLT, or all I can think about is bacon. That leads to worldly joy. Things that we touch can lead to worldly joy. The touch of someone we love, the touch of a cat, the touch of a fur for some people. I know people that go to pet stores just so they can pet the animals. They get joy out of that. Smells give us joy. And, of course, our thoughts. Assimilate these things, and those thoughts give us joy. This is not bad. This is the level that most people want to be on all their lives. They would be happy if they could just experience that 99% of the time. Unfortunately, that's not possible. What is unworldly joy? Well, quiet, secluded from sense desires, secluded from unwholesome states of mind, a monk or anyone else for that matter, enters upon and abides in the first meditative absorption, which is accompanied by thought conception and discursive thinking, and has joy and happiness born of seclusion. Okay, let's stop there for a second. This is the first meditative absorption, the first jhana. And remember, there are 4 jhanas on each level. This type of jhana is paying attention to something. This type of practice is taking an object and using it for concentration. A lot of people think that they're meditating to relax. That's backwards. You have to be relaxed in order to meditate, because meditation is a very, very active thing, at least in Buddhism. It requires a great deal of concentration and focus. If we were just meditating to relax, we could sleep, and that would do it for us. We could take a pill, that would do it for us. I could listen to, music from the 40s, that would put me to sleep. As would La Traviata, that would put me to sleep very quickly. Bob Dylan, not so much. That's my era. So we have to get to a point where we're still thinking. We still contemplate. We deconstruct our problems verbally, or what we've seen verbally. And this is meditation. This is the first level. Now let's go to the second level, with the stilling of thought conception and discursive thinking. Now we stop doing that. We're still concentrating. He enters upon and abides in the second meditative absorption, which has internal confidence and singleness of mind without thought conception and discursive thinking, and has joy and happiness born of concentration. This is called unworldly joy. Another word for that, believe it or not, is Pithi. What we call sympathetic joy, the same word is used to apply to this state, except in the translations, they usually translate that as rapture. Being enraptured by the sense that there is no longer a me who's thinking. There just is. And this just isness is a very, very important state of meditation. Another term for this state, this point of rapture, this kind of Pithi, has been popularized in Tibetan Buddhism as bliss. So that is the function of that form of meditation. And here's how it forms. The formation of unworldly joy. First, there is seclusion. Remember way back when, a few weeks ago, we were talking about renunciation. Nekama. This renunciation is the seclusion from sensual desires. It is the seclusion also from unwholesome thoughts. It is a total disdain of not the world, but how we interact with the world when our cravings begin. So we're disavowing that. And when we disavow that, we can get to the first jhana. Because as long as I'm thinking about eating tamales in Jalisco, Mexico, I am not going to get past these sense desires of taste, of sight, of sound, of touch, of aroma. They're all going to be with me. I cannot even get into meditation as long as my sense desires are active. Seclusion from unwholesome thoughts. Whoa. When people first start meditating, those are the only kinds of thoughts that tend to bubble up. Who they like, who they dislike, who they wish would have a car accident, who they wish would get fired, who they wish would leave them alone. These are unwholesome thoughts. They're very unskillful thoughts. If we can get rid of the unwholesome thoughts and the sense desires, then we get to the first jhana, the first absorption. We're still thinking about things, but we're probably thinking about things that are much more skillful than what we're normally thinking of. Things like excuse me again. Things like the teaching of the Dhamma. Things like the squirrel and the bunny rabbit outside the window. Things like concentrating on light, concentrating on a particular sound, thinking about the Four Noble Truths or the Eightfold Path. There are lots of skillful things we can think about that'll get us to this first jhana. Now, once we still those thoughts, boy, stilling thoughts is a mother, let me tell you. First of all, the brain is the brain is formed in such a way that it creates thoughts. That's part of its function. These chemicals ooze out of pores. They collect around something called a synapse. A bioelectrical charge happens, and then voila, I have a thought. German Shepherd dogs, that's a thought. See, I just pulled that right out. See what I did? My chemical structure of my brain will keep me thinking. I'll produce a thought every several seconds, but those thoughts are not discursive. That's the important point. The discursiveness, the interaction between one thought and another is, well, that's back here. So if we want to move here, we still the thoughts. The thoughts still arise, but we do not engage in them. And that leads us to the second jhana. And that gives us a spiritual, unworldly joy. By unworldly, we don't mean otherworldly, because that's still a world. Just because it's not in this one doesn't mean it's not a world. What we have with this unworldly joy is that the joy that we experience by the lack of sense desire, by the lack of discursive thinking, is unworldly. It's not connected to the world. It's connected to something else. And that is our inner sense of being. What is a still greater unworldly joy? You knew I was going to ask. You should have seen it coming. When a taint-free monk or anybody else looks upon his mind that is freed of greed, freed of hatred, freed of delusion, then arises joy, and this is called the still greater unworldly joy. It was either last week or the week before last I was talking about Nibbana. Nibbana was defined by Sariputra, the Buddha's most famous and probably best student. They called him the second Buddha. Defined the lack of greed, the lack of hatred, and the lack of delusion as nibbana. Okay, but here we're only on the joy level. There's more to come. This joy arises from a mind that is freed of greed, hate, and delusion. This joy also arises in a life of virtue, a life that is lived skillfully, harmlessly, transparently, faithfully. And this can be done in a social context or in a monastic context. I started out as a forest monk, and I really disliked the rains retreats during Vesak because there would be people there. At the time I became a forest monk, I wanted to be a hermit. I did not want to associate with people in the community. But if I did not associate with people in a community, how could I ever develop virtue of any kind? Virtue can only be developed in a social context. You cannot do it on your own. That's because we're very social beings, like bees. And what is worldly equanimity? Well, of course, worldly equanimity goes back to the I and everything else that is cognizable by the body, wished for and desired, agreeable and endearing, associated with a sense of desire and alluring. It is the equanimity that with regard to the five senses again, which is called worldly equanimity. Well, yeah, if it's worldly, then it is associated with our experience of the world. And what did we say the world was a few weeks ago? The world is my body and my five physical senses plus intellect. This means my experience of the world. Worldly equanimity. I can be very equanimous. Is that a word? I can be very Upekkish about the world. It limits my choices, as we were talking about earlier, of what I need, of what I want. I can have that kind of equanimity, and it creates a very, very happy life. But unworldly equanimity comes from another one of the jhana stages in this meditation we're talking about. It comes with the abandoning of pleasure and pain. Well, most people don't want to do this. Abandon both pleasure and pain. They're willing to abandon the pain part. We get that. That's totally understandable. But we're also to give up the pleasure part. In abandoning, he means dispassionate about it. We don't get obsessed about the pleasures of life. We don't get obsessed about the pain. This is really what's being abandoned, is the obsession we have over these things. And with the previous disappearance of gladness and sadness, and this is why people think of meditative folks as being stone-faced, a monk or anybody else enters upon and abides in the fourth meditative absorption, which has neither pain nor pleasure and has purity of mindfulness due to equanimity, and this is called unworldly equanimity. We've given up that association with the world, with the things of the world in that meditative state. Of course, then eventually you get off the cushion and it comes right back. And what is the still greater unworldly equanimity? Well, that's when a taint-free person, upon his or her mind that is freed of greed, freed of hatred, and freed of delusion, then there arises equanimity. And this is called a still greater worldly equanimity. Didn't we just read that about something else? It works the same way for all of them. And what is freedom? Well, worldly freedom is connected with the material. What is unworldly freedom? The freedom connected with the immaterial, my inner self, the me that exists when I'm not getting in the way. And what is the still greater unworldly freedom? Well, that's when a taint-free anybody looks upon his mind and he finds that mind freed of greed, freed of hatred, freed of delusion. Then there arises real freedom. Freedom from the harm I do myself. And this is how that works. We started worldly freedom, actually it should be the other way around, but we started worldly freedom, the material world. Then the unworldly freedom, which is found in the immaterial world, our psycho-spiritual self. And that comes through meditative states. Great freedom comes from no hatred, no greed, no delusion. And that too is found in meditative states, but it's translated into day-to-day action. So the Buddha did not say, give up life. He just wanted people to understand that there are different levels of freedom, of equanimity, of joy, of happiness. He wanted people to understand that when they experience on all three of these levels. Wrong one. So great freedom equals the 10 perfections. The 10 perfections, cold's getting worse instead of better. No delusion, no greed, no hate. The 10 perfections meets these other three things right there. These three absences, non-hate, non-greed, non-delusion. They meet right there in the 10 perfections. Oops. Now, traditionally there are three paths to awakening, so this explains why the Bodhisattva or Bodhisattva path was created. The first path to awakening was as a disciple of the Buddha, a Shavaka. Technically, there can't be a Shavaka today because the Buddha's not alive. A Shavaka literally means a hearer of the word. And it was assumed that the hearer of the word was one who actually heard it from the Buddha. But since Gautama has died, there can't technically be a Shavaka anymore. The second path is the path to awakening as a private Buddha, a Pacceka Buddha. One who has attained awakening on his own but was not able to teach the path or practice to others. This is a person who has never heard of a Buddha. This is a person that lived before the time of the Buddha. Today it's possible for everybody to get a hold of the teachings. But not everybody lives with that possibility because of where they're at, their religious inclinations, their economic level, their state of health, but they can still become a Pacceka Buddha. The third path is the path to awakening as a rightly self-awakened Buddha, a Sama Sambuddha. Now, this is the most difficult of the path because there can be no more Shavaka. because it's really difficult to become a Upekkha Buddha, since there is a Buddha in this dispensation. Where'd it go? There we go. The path to Sambuddha, the highest form of the path, is the one which is most logical for people to follow. First of all, it's the highest level, but it takes a long time. There was an old saying, well, there are lots of old sayings, which one do I mean? The old saying was put into the original ceremonies as the teachings of the Buddha are easy to understand, easy to practice, and immediately effective. Somewhere along the line we've forgotten that. So we tried to make things even easier. We have really diluted and diluted a lot of teaching that came from the Buddha, because we think it's so hard to become enlightened. Enlightenment is the easy part. The hard part is not being enlightened. I was asked a couple of weeks ago, how can you live without great passion? I chuckled and answered, how can you live with it? You're not really living when you're in prison. If you're imprisoned by your cravings, your thoughts, your desires, you're not living at all. You've become a slave, a prisoner, a puppet, and in a great many ways, an addict, addicted to sense desires. So why are there two versions of this thing called the paramis, or paramitas? Well, each path was defined. Oh, that's where the two comes in. Ah, I see. Why are there two versions? Well, first of all, each path was defined as consisting of perfections. Parami in Pali, paramita in Sanskrit. And it was a matter of character. These are perfections of character. There was a question as to those perfections and what exactly they were and how the paths differed from one another. Well, everybody knew the path of the Buddha was the highest form. So the Theravadins, for instance, the oldest surviving form of Buddhism, specified 10 perfections and organized the Jataka tales, the tales of reincarnation, which of course the Buddha didn't teach, but we kind of threw them into the canon just to make a point. They're all what they're called teaching stories. Nobody really expects anybody to take them literally. And if you do, talk to a monk. Anyway, as soon as possible. So the Jataka collection culminated in 10 different tales, each one illustrating one of the perfections. The Sarvastivadins, who were like the Theravadins in every way except they specified 6 perfections, and they organized their Jataka collection accordingly. Now, the Theravadins, that'd be these guys, set up house in Sri Lanka around the year 330 BCE, 350 BCE, somewhere around there. And the Sarvastivadins stayed in India. And there were 18 sects of these guys, which none of them is alive today. The Theravadins are the only survivors of the original Buddhists. Except I'm sure I'll get a hate email from somebody on the Mahayana side. Did a Buddha develop more of the same sort of perfections than an Arahant developed, or did he develop perfections of a radically different sort. Okay, those who believe that the perfections differ only in quantity took up the path of the early Buddhists as a guide for their Buddhahood. They could practice in accordance to the Pali Canon, become an Arahant, a fully enlightened being. And an Arahant is, by definition, a fully enlightened being. They're still human, though. I mean, even the Buddha said that when asked if he saw suffering, said, not only do I see it, I feel it too. An Arahant does the same thing, because he's living in what we call a skin bag. That skin bag will keep us experiencing dukkha from one level to another constantly. It'll keep us experiencing worldly joy, worldly happiness, worldly equanimity, worldly freedom, simply because we're alive and breathing. We'll still experience those, but the extent to which we will suffer over them will be greatly diminished because of the practice, because we get more comfortable in ourselves. We actually see things as they are. We have the insight into anatta, no self or selflessness, dukkha, and conditionality, anicca. Now those who are seeking Buddhahood who believe that the perfections different qualitatively, however, had to look outside of the original Pali Canon. And so the Mahayana Sutras were created. People in this later group often practice the form of meditation that included, or at inducing, visions of bodhisattvas treading the path to full Buddhahood, along with Buddhas in other world systems. These are called cosmic Buddhas and cosmic bodhisattvas. So if you didn't like, excuse me, if you thought the world, or you thought the difference was not quantity, but quality of the kind of perfections the Buddha practiced to become the Buddha, then you formed this sort of thing, looking toward these cosmic deities. And again, they're teaching tools. They're not meant to be taken literally. If we took them literally, then we would have to negate everything the Buddha ever taught, which would be unfortunate for people in my profession. These Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, it was hoped, would provide an insider's knowledge of the full Buddha's path. People did take them seriously, did take them literally, and still do. I mean, there are Buddhists living in India and Britain that are actually killing each other over whether or not a certain cosmic Buddha exists or not, and if they should be followed. Talking, of course, about the conflict between Geshe Kelsang Gyatso's followers and the Dalai Lama's followers. Yeah, it's really weird. Okay, so this gives us the rise of the Mahayana, the teachings that resulted from these versions, or visions rather, of the cosmic Buddhas and Bodhisattvas who were channeled through Buddhist shaman. We're called shamana. Became very, very diverse around the 3rd century CE. The development of the Yogacara school was an effort to combine these teachings into a single body. Today we call that that school of thought the Mahayana movement. It's a movement, it's not a tradition, it's not a school. There are many, many schools and sects and many, many traditions within the corpus of the Mahayana. But the teachings are so different and so vast in Mahayana that, and oftentimes very contradictory, that Mahayana never could achieve the same kind of unity that Theravada did, because there was just no body or body of people that could like pull it together into one single unity. And historically there had been two major ways of following the path to full Buddhahood, one coming from the Pali Canon and the other coming from these visionaries around the beginning of the Common Era. And the materials in this particular study are based upon the original Pali Canon rather than the Mahayana Canon, because we'd be here another 8 weeks. We went through the Mahayana Canon, their version of it, because it is just so broad and convoluted, and oftentimes two teachings about the same perfection will conflict. So, what is the value of the perfections? The perfections provide a person with a very reliable way of measuring how they're doing on the path. The accomplishments that they might have in the realm of work and relationships tend to turn to dust. I mean, most of us have held more than one job. A lot of us have had more than one relationship. A lot of us have had more than one pet. Things that we consider important and the neat things that we have done are often, they're always temporary, but we also tend to forget them and have to be reminded sometimes of this great accomplishment we had once done. But the perfections, because of the deal with character, once developed, they're more dependable, they're more lasting, because you've actually changed your mind, changed your attitude, changed what you're doing. And so they carry over, and beyond the stresses and problems we have associated with life. They also deserve to take a high priority in the way we plan our lives. These two facts are reflected in the two etymologies offered for the word perfection, or parami. They carry one across to the further shore, coming from the word param, and the parama means that they're foremost important. Parama, of course, is where our word primary comes from, and param is where our word parameter comes from. So it's a guideline within which we can work, a framework, and they're of highest importance on dealing with one's life and formulating the way we deal with others. Oh, and here's the 10 perfections. So, quick review. I've only got 20 minutes here, and I have 9 hours worth of material. Okay, Dhanam Parami, the generosity of giving of oneself. And remember, there are three ways that we can form or practice generosity. We can practice generosity by giving material goods, money. You can send a check to me anytime you like and get to start practicing now. The other thing is we can give sustenance. We can give food. The second way of practicing generosity, dana, is giving protection, keeping one safe from harm, keeping one safe from illness, keeping one safe from having to drink bad water, for instance. Keeping somebody safe from being excluded because of a handicap, or because they don't shave their head. Lots of ways that we can protect people. And the highest way is of giving the gift of Dhamma, the teaching itself. The teaching it's not so much important that we actually teach the words. Teaching is most effective when done by action. So if we act out the Dhamma, then we are giving the highest gift. And we talked about that a little bit when we talked about Sila Parami, the virtue, morality, proper conduct, and we talked about the 4 or 5 precepts. I should know there are 5 precepts of a layperson. They're the first 5 precepts you take as a layperson. When you take the 8 precepts, you have to take the first 5 over again. When you take the 10 to become a novice monk, you've got to take those. When you take the 16 to become a Mahayana monk, you still take those first 5 precepts again. Or when you take the 227 vows of a full monk, you still got to take the 5 first precepts. And the 5 first precepts being, I will avoid harming other people. I will avoid lying to other people. I will avoid unchastity. I will avoid, did I say stealing? Yes, no I didn't. Stealing, taking things which are not freely giving. And I will avoid buying and selling intoxicants. You know, how we view these things is that the first, we can go our whole lives without killing another living thing. That is actually pretty easy. We generally don't get the urge, we get the urge to kill, but we rarely act upon it. The idea is not just killing, it's harming in general, and there's so many ways to harm another being. If I gossip about you to somebody else, whether it's true or not is irrelevant. That harms you. It harms your reputation. It harms the way that person looks at you from now on. If I recommend a diet that turns out to be harmful for you, and you go and take the diet because you know me and you trust me, then I have harmed you. If I give you a faulty view of politics, then I have harmed you. The second one about honesty is transparency. Being honest with myself as well as you. This is a lot harder because the Buddha had said that anybody who would lie is capable of anything, any kind of transgression. Because they're not just deceiving others, they're deceiving themselves as well. They're deceiving themselves because they believe that there is no consequence to their action. Not believing in karma, that what goes around comes around, is a very foolish and naive thing. We create our karma by what we think, by what we say, by what we do. And because of the laws of dependent co-arising conditionality, it always comes back to us. The more skillfully we act, the better the results. The more unskillfully we act, the harsher the results. So, and the last of the 5 is the one about intoxication. And of course, that's not really about drinking to become intoxicated or using drugs to become intoxicated. The Buddha really didn't have an opinion on that. There's a sutta about it's called he who was taken to drink, and it was a guy died, and people came up to him and said, well, Buddha, what do you think happened to him after he died? And he said, well, he went to a Pure Land. He went to heaven. He was a great practitioner, had great faith in the truth, in the teaching. He said, how can you say that, Buddha? He was a drunk. And he said, maybe he was. But he didn't run away with it. Buddha recognized that drinking heavily is a physical thing. Taking drugs is a physical thing. it's not really an issue of morality. Because if I sit at home and decide to get snockered tonight, that harms no one but maybe me. And it's not my intention to harm myself. So it was this kind of nonsense that we create in our mind, which the Buddha found was immoral. When it affects the mind, it is an act of immorality. Nekama parami, renunciation, well, we talked about that. That's having the, denouncing the way we interact with the world, denouncing our sense desires, denouncing, a lot of social aspects of our life. The barriers we put up, the harmful politics, the harmful economics, renouncing our own greed, renouncing the things that harm us and keep us off the path. Then there's the Panya Parami, which is, of course, the one about transcendental wisdom, which is more about understanding, more about discernment, having good judgment, of going beyond the sense data that we're normally confronted with in our day-to-day life. We get in so much sense data. It's amazing, because we can only focus in on one thing at a time, but we're aware of an infinite number of things going on, but our brain can only catalog so much information. And wisdom is an ability that we develop to determine what data is important, what data is not important. The more aware we become, especially through the practice of meditation, the more data we can take in and deal with and formulate. So we become wiser because we can assimilate more. And we've seen this throughout our lives, where people, or you yourself, may have just known something was going to happen, or just sensed somebody was at the door. This wisdom comes from actually taking in the data around us, putting it together, and bam, there's the information. It's not all that spooky. Viriya Parami. Viriya is interesting. It means diligence, vigor, effort. And usually that's taken to mean a vow or an affirmation of some kind. It's interesting that this word viriya, that one there, let me move that so you can see it. Viriya is where the Latin word veritas comes from, meaning truth, veracity, verify. All these words come from this one, because it takes effort and diligence to uncover the truth. The truth doesn't often appear spontaneously before our eyes, which is probably a good thing considering the way a lot of us live. And 6, Kanti Parami, patience, tolerance, forbearance, acceptance, and endurance. A totally non-bigoted life. A life that is patient with the stuff that comes up in our minds. Before 1954-55, almost every etymology available in English said patience came from kom, meaning with, and patio, or compassion came from kom, meaning with, and patio meaning patience. Compassion being able to be patient with the situation that arises in front of you. In Kanti, well, after that, somebody changed it and they decided it wasn't from the Latin, it was from the French, compatio, or compassio, having to ancient French, having to do with passion, Not sure which one's right on that one. The jury's still out. But patience and tolerance is not about me being patient with you or anybody being patient with anybody else. Patience, which is a real gift that we give to other people, is being able to be patient with the stuff that's arising in our own mind. There's a lot of stuff that bubbles up when the kids are screaming. The cat wants attention. The boss is yelling. There's a deadline for your work. And thoughts just keep bubbling up. Well, we just talked about the papanchas, that seepage, the proliferation of thought. Khanti is more about being patient with that, putting that to the side, so we can really pay attention to what's going on in front of us. That's the way that we can be harvest, to nurture acceptance with others, forbear the situation that we have. Forbear, another interesting word. Let me click on that real quick. Forbear. To forego bearing something means not to carry it. It's just a decision. I'm not going to pick that up and carry it. And that's a lot of what patience has to deal with. It means you can endure more if you're that way. Satya parami, truthfulness, honesty, and we speak of it in terms of transparency. And what's keeping us from being transparent with ourselves and often with others is our emotions, because we don't understand our own fears. We're not comfortable enough with ourselves to lift that veil of paranoia, of fear, of anger, of what's really behind love, what's really behind the feelings we have when we feel completely satisfied for 3 or 4 minutes at least. Adhitthana parami, determination, resolution. And we did a lot of talking about that, having to do with what we need to be determined about. We need to be determined about what's going on in the body. We need to be determined about carrying on in the path. Need to be determined about being honest. And of course, we need to be determined about being calm. Upekkha parami, which we spoke about this evening. And then lastly, well, next to lastly, is the Metta parami, loving kindness, that pulls all the other 8 ones before it together into one solid core practice that we can take it into the world and actually measure how well we're doing. And lastly, Upekkha parami, which is the crowning achievement of the practice of the 10 perfections, in that it leads to equanimity, serenity, and calm. For those of us that have not yet reached Buddhahood, I am here to tell you that a lifetime of practicing this has created a great deal of calm in my life. And it is true that this teaching is easy to understand, fairly easy to do, usually, but it's immediately effective once we do. Now, are there any questions during this last 5 minutes? Well, if there are no questions, is anybody typing? No, everybody chat. Oh, you're all watching the cooking show, aren't you? Okay. Where the famous chef meets a homemaker. Okay, well with that ends this class on the 10 Paramitas. If you enjoyed it, please come back again on October 14th when we will begin a new class. Oh, there it is. The Selfless Mind. Same time, same back channel. And it concerns itself with the Buddhist view of self and Buddhist psychology, including the continuity of personality, rebirth, and antara, which is the intermediate state between lives, and not to be confused with the Tibetan bardo, which is a longer time, 56 days, I think. Anyway, so that's it. All for me. I hope you enjoyed the series of talks, and I do hope you will come back later. Thank you. Good night.